Gaza has seen no respite this weekend. At least 166 people have been killed in just the last 24 hours, bringing the total number of deaths in Gaza since October 7th to 20,400. Those numbers come from the Gaza Health Ministry, and NBC News has not been able to independently verify them. But yesterday I explained in detail why we at NBC think those numbers are probably accurate and possibly even an undercount of the dead. You can find that explanation online, and I will post it again. Israel's campaign continues to empty out entire towns and cities toward the border, where civilians are also subject to bombing and ongoing airstrikes. Nowhere is safe in Gaza has become the tragic refrain of aid workers on the ground. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden got personally involved in the unfolding situation overseas yesterday, holding a phone call with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. According to a White House readout of the call, Biden reiterated the importance of protecting civilians in Gaza, including aid workers who have not been spared from the indiscriminate, relentless bombing. The United Nations alone says that on average, one or two of their workers have died in Gaza each day of the war, totaling roughly 135 people. However, Biden fell short of explicitly calling for a ceasefire, despite overwhelming support for such a measure from the international community. That phone call came just one day after the United Nations Security Council approved a watered-down resolution that urges the immediate delivery of aid. Now, since the outbreak of hostilities, we've heard accounts from a number of aid workers, from Israeli and Palestinian civilians, and from politicians. But largely absent have been the voices of those who have previously been involved in combat, those who are most familiar with how Israeli military strategy plays out on the ground. One such group is Breaking the Silence. It's an organization comprised of Israeli military veterans who collect testimonies from former soldiers to educate the public on how the occupation is actually enforced. The shocking incident last week, where 3 Israeli hostages were shot by their own military after fleeing Hamas captors, has brought increased attention to how Israel is waging the war. In that if 3 Israeli hostages, shirtless to prove they were not wearing explosive vests, carrying white flags of surrender and speaking in Hebrew, were shot accidentally, imagine what it's like to be an innocent Palestinian civilian in the line of fire. Avner Gavriyahu, executive director of Breaking the Silence and a former Israeli sniper and paratrooper, told the Associated Press that soldier accounts from previous military engagements indicate that once an area is deemed clear of civilians, soldiers are instructed to shoot everything that moves. Quote, the Army said this happened in violation of the rules of engagement. I'm skeptical of that. Based on what we know of previous operations in Gaza, how many Palestinians were shot at like this, end quote. Joining us today from Tel Aviv is Avner Gavriyahu. He's the executive director of Breaking the Silence. He previously served as a paratrooper and a sniper for the Israeli Defense Forces. Avner, thank you for being with us. I have to ask you, first of all, it's tough being Breaking the Silence. It's tough being a former IDF soldier who gives testimony about what happened when you were there, because in times of relative peace in Israel, people, particularly in this extremist Netanyahu government, call you and people like you unpatriotic.
Hi, Ali. It's great to be on your show again. And yes, I mean, I think that part of the biggest challenge that unfolded after October 7th is the frustration that many in our community, and definitely in Breaking the Silence, experience as we, for years, have been petrified of something horrific like this unfolding. And what we saw on October 7th hit us deeply, hit us personally. I know people that were murdered in the Hamas terror attack. Some of Breaking the Silence's members were killed in the various communities on the South. But I think that there is so much emphasis put into the question on why Israel went to war, where there, I can't necessarily argue. I mean, the events of October 7th were horrific, but not so much emphasis on how we're fighting our wars. And I think that as you mentioned, the killing of the 3 hostages opened up a window into some of the practices on the ground that, of course, risk, and we've been talking about this for years, risk the lives of innocent civilian Palestinians, but in this round also threatened the lives of the hostages that are still in the Strip. And we, of course, course, need an immediate release of them, but the dangerous rules of engagement have threatened also our civilians.
Avner, let's talk about, you make an interesting point here. I was speaking to our friends from B'Tselem yesterday, and again, everybody's clear. What happened on October 7th was horrible. It was a massacre. And Israel, like any country, should and would have a right to defend themselves in doing so. The how is important, and in fact, the international conversation has turned to how, right? The criticism from the Biden administration, although it finances so much of this stuff, is how you're going to do this, how it ends, when it ends. What's your sense of how to think about this? How can this end? How should it end? And how does Israel keep safe? Because the feeling amongst Israelis is we would like to be safe. Whether or not they want a one-state solution or a two-state solution or whatever, people deserve to be safe.
Right. People deserve to be safe. And I think that part of this means that Israelis, of course, need to be safe and Palestinians need to be safe. And that is actually, we believe, or I believe, is tied together, which I think is some of what we've been ignoring for the past, 20 some or arguably over 50 years. But I think that part of what we should be looking at as the situation in Gaza is unfolding is the immense use of firepower used, some good reporting that's out there talking about the use of weapons, and even more interestingly, the choosing of targets. I think something we haven't seen in previous operations, and this was said openly by the IDF, is targeting houses of Hamas members. In many cases, the Hamas members are not in the house. In previous operations, we've seen warning shots. In this round, entire stories with them, maybe dozens or more people that are not involved, or not Hamas members, are attacked. I think part of the question is, does that make us Israelis safer? When you look at the rules of engagement of soldiers from previous operations, talking about shooting anything that you see in these areas that we cleared out, right? Some soldiers or officers talk about shoot anything that doesn't look specifically innocent. Does that make us as Israelis safer? I think not. And I think that part of the question is, and this is now, butting heads, is this ongoing assault on the Strip getting us closer to the core of this mission of getting our hostages back? And I think that not only that the answer is no, it seems that the growing death, the tragedy unfolding in Gaza is only strengthening Hamas, which is exactly the opposite of what this government promised to do.
Ironically, strengthening Hamas even in the West Bank, where there's no meaningful Hamas presence. You were a paratrooper, you were a sniper, so you exist on the targeted part of what existed on what is the targeted part of the IDF. The criticism from much of the world is if you insist on rooting out every last Hamas person you can find, do it in a targeted manner. What we've seen is a lot of bombing, and in fact, what we're learning is that more than half the bombing is dumb bombs, not targeted bombs. Is there a way for Israel's very, very sophisticated and well-funded military to conduct targeted ways of eliminating the armed Hamas threat and minimizing civilian deaths?
Well, I mean, I think that in breaking the silence, we're not in the job of, consulting to the IDF how to be, a more moral army. But I do think that as the reality is unfolding, and it seems as if this operation or war is not going to end in the near future. Maybe some of it will be minimized, but still continue. I actually think it is important to dive into what are the tactics that are being used. From what we know from previous operations, some of the doctrines or the big military doctrines that are used are sort of doctrines that were developed in the various Gaza operations, but definitely in the last war in Lebanon was called the Dahya Doctrine, which is basically, sort of quoting army officials, using a disproportionate response. And I think, and in some cases, targeting widespread facilities and so on and so forth. And I think that in that sense, there are choices that you make in the battlefield. And I think that those choices start with the targets that you choose and how you verify them. The choices, as you mentioned, have to do with the kind of bombs that you use. I mean, using a dumb bomb, as you call it, this sort of translating that, when you use a dumb bomb, you're basically using a bomb that works on statistics, right? In order to eliminate the specific target, you have to shoot a big number of bombs in order to make sure that the explosion around each bomb will eventually destroy your target. That promises not necessarily intentional killing. That's not what we said or what we have evidence for. Maybe there were specific cases, but not in a widespread way. But yes, the indiscriminate bombing.
Right.
And I think that is not a way forward. I think definitely not a way to shift public opinion within the Strip, but also not a way to move forward to a day after where we don't conduct our relationship with Palestinians in the West Bank or in Gaza through the scope of our gun.
Avner, we have much to talk about. I hope you'll come back and join me again. Avner Gavriyahu is the executive director of Breaking the Silence. Avner and I were together in the West Bank, including in Hebron, where he showed me a lot of what was going on the ground.